So welcome to our fifth and final session of Big God Questions. We hope you've enjoyed these videos and these chats, these interviews that we've been able to do over the last few weeks. We thank you for sticking around and sticking with us. I'm here today with Audrey Carter, and she is one of our high schoolers, one of our teens here at Grace Lutheran. And Audrey, could you just maybe introduce yourself and say how you got connected here at Grace?
Well, I'm Audrey. I'm a sophomore at Hinsdale Central. I came here about a year or two ago.
Okay, yeah.
My family just switched churches, and now we're here, and it's been really nice. I got confirmed last year, and I kind of got to know everyone a little bit more.
Yeah. Well, it's been great to have you here. It was wonderful having you kind of go through confirmation, and it was actually a little bit, every confirmation student does a project at the end before they're confirmed, and it was your project that you put together through confirmation that made me think, as I was wondering who I could interview, that you would be a really great person for this question.
Thank you.
I really think you're a very deep thinker, and you're somebody who, I mean, it can be kind of intimidating, but you can really dive into stuff, and I appreciate that, and it's just been wonderful having you here. Helping with Grace Place, the Sunday school program on occasion. It's been fantastic. So today we're talking about this big question, where is God in suffering? That could even be maybe simplified to why is there suffering? And that's a really big question. Some of the ones in the past couple weeks we might have been able to kind of get towards an answer. I'm not necessarily expecting us to do that today. If we do, this will be a really great video. I'll give it that much.
All right.
So that's the big question. And what I thought we'd start with is trying to find a way to narrow that question down. And the way I thought we could maybe do that at the beginning, at least, is instead of looking in the very big picture with suffering is to talk about fairness and what that means. And I think that's related to suffering a little bit in this question, because we have in each of us kind of a sense of what's fair. When someone does something bad and something bad happens to them, that seems to be about right. When there's a good person living, as best we can tell, a really good life and things are going well, that seems to fit with what we think maybe God might be doing, or at least the world works in a way that feels right to us when things are fair. And it's when things become unfair that we start asking this question, where is God in suffering? So the first question I have for you, Audrey, is in general, would you say the world is a fair place? And then if it is or isn't, do you think the world would be better if things were more fair, if things were distributed more evenly, or just if things seem to work more along that idea of fairness that we have?
Well, no, I don't really think the world is a fair place.
Sure,
I think
yeah.
Being where I am in society and where I think a lot of us are living in this neighborhood, it's very difficult to look at that and contrast that with the place that other people are and to say that the world's a fair place. Yeah. Because personally, I haven't done anything to get here. And I know that there are a lot of people who have suffered who haven't done anything to get there either, so I think it's very difficult to look at that and say, oh yeah, the world is fair and good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people.
Yeah.
And I think the world would certainly be fair if things were and experiences were distributed in a fair way. I don't necessarily know if it would be better. It's kind of difficult to say that without seeing it in practice.
There's a lot of moving pieces that you don't know, changing them, what will it do to to society and economy and everything like that, of course. Yeah.
But I think it's definitely, when it comes to basic human things, be it food or happiness or whatever you consider to be the most basic human right, I think it's our responsibility as people who have who have had a better experience in this world and who are put at a fairer place. I think it's our responsibility to distribute those basic things to the people who don't have it. And I think God gives us the opportunity to do it, and it's our responsibility when that opportunity is given to take that and to help people until we can't.
Absolutely. I think so. Maybe drilling into this question a little more, trying to get a sense of that idea of fairness and where it hits us or not. I was wondering if there's ever been a situation in your life and your family and kind of your experience in the world thus far that you've felt that something was unfair. And it doesn't have to be like a huge thing. It can be a tiny or petty thing. But I'm trying to get a sense of where does that line, where is that sense in us that can tell when things are fair or not?
Well, yeah, I think, like you said, a lot of my experiences with things being unfair. I mean, obviously, I'm very fortunate. Personally, I haven't suffered all that much, but I think, like all people, I've lost people, and I've there are people who I've been very close with, especially, who have dealt with situations where it doesn't seem like they should have to deal with that at all. That they are truly the most pure and positive people, and yet they're stricken with something, be it a mental illness or something physical or just a situation that they're forced to deal with, and it doesn't seem like that should be happening in any respect. And it's very, very difficult in those situations to look at that, whether it's happening to you or whether it's happening to someone you're close to. It's very difficult to look at that and to be able to see God in that scenario. Because there's, especially when you're dealing with that, it's very difficult when your brain is constantly telling you that there isn't hope in a scenario. It's very hard to reach out to other people and to see God in those people, or God anywhere else you may find it otherwise, especially when you're suffering.
Sure. So, How did you deal with those kind of situations? Did you I mean, you just kind of let the time pass and see where you end up, or is there anything you tried to do to see where God might be even when it seems hopeless?
Well, part of it I think is waiting for the time to pass and knowing, even in a more broad sense, even if it's not what you're telling yourself then, but knowing very broadly that it will come to pass can be very helpful. But I think the biggest thing that can help you get through is the people in your life. My mom told me when a couple years ago, she was talking about her life, and it was kind of like the first time that I had realized that my mom had a life before I was born.
Sure, yeah.
But she was telling me that she really believed in angels, and she believed that there were people in her life that were there. And I think my dad has told me a very similar thing before too. But that there were people in their lives that were there for a reason, that God put them there for a reason, and had really helped them through the difficulties in their life. And I think my parents and the people who have been close to me have helped me through some of those scenarios. And there are times that I could not have gotten through something without their words or without the words of someone else. They've truly saved my life.
Pulling that out. So I think we're kind of drawing into this next question as we talk about, this idea of things not being fair, wondering where God is. In general, with suffering, do you think that suffering could ever serve a purpose, or is there ever good inside of suffering? Is there any upside to it, I suppose? And that's a weird kind of question to ask, but I think we're kind of hinting at it so far with our conversation.
I think if you look closely at any situation, you can find something good out of most things. I think suffering can be really beneficial in bringing a community together, or at the very least, suffering, it can help us know when times are good, can help us truly appreciate those times.
Sure.
But there's also instances of suffering where it's really difficult to look at that, and even though there might be a silver lining to it, it's very difficult to see the silver lining as something that is worth so much pain.
Right. And I think you're, again, hitting the nail on the head, because this is such a tricky topic, because anytime you try to say, well, suffering lets us see how good things are, then what does that mean when a child gets cancer, when there are wars, when you look back at the Holocaust? It's so many things that we try to do to kind of fix suffering and make it something that God is secretly doing that just tests us and makes it good. They just completely fall flat once you have any real kind of suffering. Once it hits you, those words almost don't mean anything anymore.
Yeah.
And it's it's just incredibly difficult to try and pull something out of that. There's a little story I really like, and there's a very famous writer. He actually just died a couple of years ago, Elie Wiesel. He was, you think you might have, I think his book Night has been required reading for some high schoolers around. You familiar with that?
Yes, I am.
I thought you might be. I couldn't remember, but I thought you might be. So this writer, he was a child during the Holocaust and was in a concentration camp, and tells this story of a rabbi and all of these people in the concentration camp coming together, and essentially enough people were saying that God has failed us. If you remember in the Old Testament, the covenant that God made with the Jewish people, with the people of Israel, with the Hebrew people, was that God would protect them and be their God, and they would do certain things. And so most of the commandments are the people trying to live up to their part of the covenant, and then God would do certain things. And so here they are in this concentration camp, death literally surrounding them at every side. And they're saying God has not lived up to God's side of the deal, and we want someone to answer for this. We want to do something. And so the rabbi says, well, we're going to have a trial. God is going to go on trial here, and we're going to bring the evidence on both sides. And they do that. It's kind of strange sort of thing to do, but they do that. And when the evidence comes through, they declare God guilty. God, you've not kept your promise. You've not done what you're supposed to do, and so you're guilty of this. And so after that sentence is declared, the rabbi kind of looks up, and then he looks over and says, and now it's time for evening prayers. And so let's go pray. And so something about that is so powerful to me, that even in the midst of the most horrible suffering I'm sure any of us could imagine, even when they have just kind of yelled and condemned God with destroying and essentially letting all of them die, the response is to go back to the prayers again. And so it's this weird kind of back and forth that God is still there in suffering, and even if we're yelling and screaming at God, even if it seems like God isn't there at all, the thing we come back to is still that piece of tradition, and that asking the very same thing again. And so I think that's maybe, if we're going to have any answer to the question, where is God in suffering, and I even hesitate to give it that much, is that God is present when those chains of suffering are broken. Yeah. When people find a way to take these horrible experiences and not let it define them, but to kind of give them a mission of ensuring it can never happen again to anyone else. And there is some good in that. I don't know if it offsets the bad of what happened. I hesitate at all to put it in that kind of terminology, but I think at least we can say that God is present sometimes in some places in the midst of suffering, and helping to pull something out of it. But thank you, I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Well, as we're kind of coming to our last question, I want to give maybe a lighter question as we kind of finish this off. It gets pretty heavy pretty fast when we start talking about what is the point of suffering, and we didn't even tie into like Jesus' suffering, which is a whole big piece of Christianity. Jesus suffering on the cross, and we do believe that a lot of good came out of that, and that God brought resurrection through that. I think that could be, we've talked about that in some of our past sessions and the big God questions, but that could be a whole nother topic too. But as we kind of come to the end of this one, I want to ask if you could ask God any question, and it doesn't have to be related to suffering, but if you could ask God any question at all, and we're going to pretend God will give you an answer to this question, what question would you ask?
Well, I think it would be tied to suffering, because I think there are a lot of, it's when you have the belief in something that is inherently good and all-powerful, the fundamental question is, and
what
as
about
much
all
as
this
you can,
bad stuff, right? Yeah.
As much as you can try and find an answer to it and find a silver lining, it's still very difficult to see the suffering of others and exist in your own suffering in those times, and to not want to ask God, why is this happening to me? Why is this happening to other good people in this world? And even to bad people in this world, why is suffering happened to them? And so I think if I were to ask God one question, that would be the question, because I think it's very, very easy to find beauty in the good times and beauty even when there's it's not good and it's not bad. It's very easy to look at the simplicity of the world and find beauty in that.
Yeah.
But when you are suffering and when you're seeing suffering, that I think is one of the few times when it's very difficult to find any beauty or any good at all.
Well, anything else you'd like to share or ask me or anything as we kind of wrap this up?
No, I think that's pretty much it.
There was a lot of good stuff there. No, that's great.
Thank you.
Good. Well, I want to thank you, Audrey, for sitting down with me, for being brave enough to tackle this question. The last question, I think, is probably the hardest of all of the 5 I've dealt with, and you've done wonderfully. I appreciate everything you've brought to the table here.
Thank you.
It's been a wonderful pleasure, and we just love having you here, having you help in Grace Place and in worship and so many other things. So thank you for coming. And thank you, all of you, for tuning in to each of these sessions. If you missed any before, you can just kind of scroll down the page. There should be a whole bunch there in the blog. And please, as always, leave us a question or comment in just that comment box below. We'll try and get back to each and every one of them. Thank you again, and thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.